Apophis. Revelation 8, verse 10. Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch.
Apophis Asteroid Apocalypse Episode 9, written by J. M. Conradi. Continued from Episode 8. Day D+2. Sheila did not attend the community meeting as scheduled, and they doubted many would. There was a thick atmosphere of shock, disaster, and fear hiding in the murky air. Nobody expected it to be like this. And despite their best intentions, most people had suddenly tried to flee somewhere by car on April 10, when it became clear the global elite had fled to secret bunkers. Marius reported from the lookout that none of their three neighbors were active, and several buildings in the direction of the school were smoldering ruins. With the telescope he only once fleetingly saw humans through the murky air, and could not find them again. Operating a telescope that accurately was tricky, they were still learning. That fleeting moment was very disturbing though, and most of their family meeting that evening was spent on that, instead of the mundane progress of their survival plans. The people Marius saw, seemed wounded, by burns, radiation or toxic air and water, and violently crazy. They were vandalizing or they were looting. From a distance those look similar. Without discussing it yet, Ian used his lookout shift to focus the telescope on the mountain reserve just to the north. He imagined that he saw some movement there, but could not see more. He had not yet discussed Plan B with his family because the idea that they might have to leave their safe house would be traumatic. Make no mistake, people were in a state of shock after the greatest natural disaster in the history of human civilization, and complete betrayal by government, governance, society, and the media. Everyone just dealt with it differently, but shock and fear were simmering just below the surface. Plan B had to wait a while. Let's wallow in some kind of normalcy for a day or two. Each one of them was busy with routine tasks. Even having potable water from the rainwater tank was a lot of work. To boil the water, one first had to make fire, and they were working on their stock of wood in fear of running out of fuel. Making charcoal would take months, so it had to start. Then using and washing the filters without water taps. How did people cope before technological conveniences? As they worked, something else worried them. Were there faraway rumbles or tremors, or was it their imagination? Only much later would they piece together what was happening to the world at this point. Just when the volcanoes were beginning to simmer down, the two failed nuclear explosions caused by North Korea reignited the unease in nature. Just when Russia and China began negotiating the division of Korea, world peace was thrown into chaos by events in the Middle East. A rogue faction fighting a new revolution in Iran announced a jihad and launched tactical nukes against Israel. With the USA paralyzed, they thought that nation would be weak. They were wrong. The Dome of Iron did its job, but poor technology caused two mishaps with Iran's attack. A low-potency nuclear device missed the target and fell in Jordan, destroying Petra, and one blew up in Iran. Accusations flew back and forth, and distrust escalated. Israel only used what little of its air force was still operational, to attack missile sites, but several nations believed the explosion in Iran was a nuclear attack from Jerusalem. Struggling governments in Europe would send diplomats to the region to personally convey messages to warn and calm down the call for war, but they would largely be too late. Communication and transport were slow, except inside the trained military. A joint force was dispatched to northern Israel by several armies with or without the consent of any government. Having lost contact with Washington for days, small U.S. forces in the region decided to converge on Israel to help their ally. A horrible battle would ensue at the Mount of Megiddo by day D+6 despite threats and pleas by Europe, China, and Egypt, where a moderate government was still clinging to power amid regional disasters and famine. Despite the major nuclear powers not being involved, the fallout of 4 nuclear explosions further contaminated the atmosphere by day D+6, the 2 from North Korea, and 2 by Iran. Depending on where the wind blew clouds to, many water sources became contaminated, and when radiation from the Apophis strikes receded, invisible nuclear radiation affected some areas. A dire short-term future awaited agriculture in large parts of the world. It was the worst kind of apocalypse. Billions of humans had survived, but collectively the world economy was being destroyed. Those who think the market system was superfluous for such a large population, and could be replaced by local or government-controlled production, were about to experience firsthand what a global Zimbabwe would feel like. But there would be no chance to repent and turn back. Everyone's worst intentions were taking control of Earth. Unaware of all that at the time, they slept exhausted but under the false impression that their home was still as safe and nurturing as always despite the apocalypse. During the night there were faraway screams coming closer. It would later become clear that local wars for resources had already begun, and something even worse. Day D+3, fuel had been almost impossible to obtain for a week now to refill the gas tanks of vehicles or generators. The far-off sound of generators woke him in the night. Really? Were people trying to run out of gas within the first week? His family was rationing the use of fuel as much as possible. Except for the one that exploded, their cars and fuel containers were all filled up, but Ion did make 1 or 2 sorties to check out the neighborhood in the direction of the nearest gas stations. The area was eerily quiet and empty. Many appeared to have fled in their cars when the heat, the ash, the lack of electricity and the panic of not being told what to do took hold. They were probably stuck in gridlock somewhere on a highway, with dwindling fuel tanks if they survived the fires, poisonous clouds, and burning debris. In fact, with their telescope he did catch a glimpse or two of elevated main roads in the distance, all packed with motionless vehicles. In an area with more cars than adults due to virtually non-existent public transport, the roads simply could not deal with a mad exodus exacerbated by damage to the infrastructure. Where were people trying to go to? It did not make sense except if they thought this was only a local disaster. In the afternoon there was some rain, but Biff tested some raindrops and found them full of toxins, probably collected in the atmosphere. They kept the inflow of their rainwater tank closed. Their geysers ran empty, would have to be manually refilled with buckets of rainwater, so they decided to limit showers to 3 minutes per person per week. Ian wondered whether they'll be safe that long. That night, gunshots and screams were much too close to them, and on day D+4 Marius noted what looked like a crazed crowd on a mall's rooftop, visible by telescope a few miles away. Nothing on that roof, so were they also scouting after emptying the mall? Too far away to see detail, but they behaved strangely. Irrationally he wondered whether their roof-high avocado pear tree, now loaded with mature fruit, would be visible that far? Events far away in the Middle East were careering out of control, but they knew nothing about that at the time. Later in retrospect, what seemed to keep the world from all-out nuclear war were Russia and China keeping each other in check with warnings, given the silence of the USA. Britain and northern France still functioned and spent precious jet fuel sending representatives armed with solar satellite phones to a few important countries. Negotiations were stripped down to basics, but famine and polluted water would soon cause an inward focus by most government remnants in the short term. With street lights out, the question by night became whether to have any light for visibility, or to have darkness to avoid being visible. Ian's family chose the latter. He had one infrared scope, so they took turns as night watchmen using the infrared to see. Invisibility soon turned out to be a wise choice. To be continued in episode 10.
Asteroid Apophis. Asteroid Apophis. Asteroid Apophis.